Everybody's muted. Thank you, Deirdre. We have some background this time. The stern, no, they're not stern wheelers, they're side wheelers, steamboats on the Mississippi River. Last week, we asked the question, what have African Americans contributed to our country? And one answer was music and rhythm that the slaves brought from Africa, from West Africa. And that's continuing, we're continuing the same theme today. Last week we saw that the slaves on the plantations, sugar plantations, cotton plantations in the South, developed musical instrument, which is there's only one truly American musical instrument, and that is the banjo, developed, invented by the slaves on the plantation. And also we visited some of the field songs, the work songs of the slaves, the sad songs of the blues, which came out of the field work songs. We visited the spirituals, the minstrel shows, and today we're continuing the same theme. We're going to be visiting the ragtime music. All of these, of course, developed by the African Americans over a period of 400 years. We'll be starting with 1899, Scott Joplin and the ragtime piano, followed by Dixieland jazz, a huge moment in American musical creativity when the blacks in New Orleans developed totally new type of music, jazz, Dixieland jazz. We're going up to, and many different forms of jazz developed out of the Dixieland. We'll be going up to Harlem. There were an extraordinary number of great songwriters and musicians in Harlem. And finally, we'll be visiting rock and roll. So to start off, I want to start with, we're going to be able to see and hear, we hope, one African American's version of a revered song in our culture. So we're going back to Woodstock, the Woodstock Festival, August of 1969. That was 51 years ago. So here is Jimi Hendrix.
Sorry.
Here is Jimi Hendrix. There.
Well, we're awake now.
You're off and running.
Sorry.
The best way to burn fat
Sorry.
is with more fat. And
There we go.
All right. So Jimmy, that is a hard act to follow. But that was, of course, Woodstock. That was August 18th, 1969. One of the most extraordinary creative pieces of performance in the 20th century. And the organizer of the Woodstock Festival estimated that about 50,000, they hoped that 50,000 people would show up. How many did show up? 500,000, 500,000 people. It was really one of the notable events of the 20th century. Incredibly creative by Jimi Hendrix. So what we've seen is that was one African-American man after 350 years of Afro-American music developing from the slaves on the plantations through all these different changes, climaxing in with Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock. Okay, now you have had a chance to check your outline. We're going to the topic of ragtime music and ragtime piano. On the screen, there it is. You can see this musical score on the screen. Okay, what was ragtime? Ragtime is a type of syncopation. What does that mean? What is syncopation? It's not easy to describe, but in short, it's the merging of two totally different rhythms, two totally different beats. The score on top is the traditional European music, 4/4 time, 4/4 tempo. And you see the accent is always on the first beat, the first and the third, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And with the ragtime, that is played in the left hand. Now look at the lower score. That's the same notes, but the accent or the beat is totally different. The beat is on the normally unaccented second and fourth count of the measure. Like if you're clapping, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those two very drastically different rhythms are overlaid one on top of the other, played at the same time. So in the And the ragtime is principally a piano form of music. As I mentioned, the left hand plays the standard European traditional rhythm, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. And the right hand, and this is the African contribution, one of many African rhythms, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So in other words, the African rhythm that's called the offbeat. The offbeat, and which is played with the right hand of the ragtime pianist. It's the most extraordinary combination. By the way, what does the word syncopation come from? The word syncopation comes from two ancient Greek words, syn, which means with, and kopto, which means to cut or to cut out. So the word syncopation means cutting out a segment. It's cutting out one beat, one of the 4 beats of the measure. So you have 2 drastically different tempos played at the same time. So now that helps, instead of just looking at the score, it helps to hear some sort of this coming up in a few seconds is example of ragtime piano, played by myself, by the way. Let's switch. And the song is, this is my CD, ragtime piano CD. By the way, the riverboat in the background, that's the Queen of the West. I was working as piano player on the riverboat. I did something like 800 or 900 trips up the Columbia River and the Snake River up as far as Lewiston, Idaho, and down to the mouth of the Columbia, 7-day cruises. The first riverboat, the first stern wheeler for 80 years that was built in the Pacific Northwest, I think on Bainbridge in the shipyard. I'm a little embarrassed by the uniform there, the bright red, but for a low-key person, for me, that was unusual. Anyway, so the song we're going to hear is called Whispering, classic ragtime. Whispering was written in 1920. That means it's 101 years old right now. So let's go ahead and hear Whispering, ragtime piano. Listen for the bass and the offbeat in the right hand. There, that's classic. By the way, here's the other CD, Ragtime Banjo and Piano, with Diana and myself. We're going to hear Diana's banjo later on. Actually, it's going to be at the beginning of next week. We're going to hear our whole band. That rhythm, that ragtime rhythm, my friend Laura Lee Northcott, whom most of us know, told me something really interesting. Laura Lee, of course, has been teaching in the elementary schools here in the Methow 35 years. She also has worked with Black students down in Oakland, California. She told me something startling that she learned. By the way, she also was the lead singer and the creator of the trio Horse Crazy. They've been on tour quite a bit. They're very notable in the Pacific Northwest, and their CDs have won some awards. when she was working with students down in Oakland, there was one group of fifth graders, fifth grade girls, and they were so good, they were on the radio in Oakland every week for some time. Anyway, Laura Lee said if she used music in her classroom here in the Mattau quite a bit, and she said that when white kids clap, they always clap one, just as in, I'm going to go back to this. They clap like the upper one. They're on the traditional first and third, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the kids down in Oakland, the black kids always clap the opposite. They clap on the second beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. She was just amazed, like the black young people in Oakland still are carriers of the African rhythm. This is 400 years after the slaves came, bringing their sophisticated, complex rhythms from Africa. And in black student groups, they clap with that offbeat rhythm. I thought that was just fascinating. So ragtime. Oh, another example of ragtime. By the way, the most famous of the ragtime composers was Scott Joplin, whom you see here. He was one of the first to publish there were a lot of black ragtime piano players who would travel from one town to another. But Scott Joplin is virtually the first one to publish his tunes on sheet music. But one of his compositions, he became very famous again in 1973 when this movie came out, The Sting. And the soundtrack for The Sting, by the way, that won the Oscar Best Film of the Year in 1973. The Academy Awards were early in 1974. And also the Best Musical Oscar of the Year went to Scott Joplin's The Entertainer, which became, it made #1 in the chart, so it was very popular. And now we're going to hear Scott Joplin's The Entertainer as it became popular again in 1974. All right. So The Entertainer swept the nation, and so Scott Joplin became renowned again in the 1970s. One of several revivals of ragtime piano. The ragtime piano was created on this map. It shows the Mississippi River from Chicago all the way down to New Orleans. The ragtime piano actually originated in several different towns. up the Mississippi, like St. Louis, New Orleans, of course, Sedalia, Missouri, and Cincinnati. But it became, well, St. Louis was a great hub of ragtime piano, particularly the Rosebud Cafe in St. Louis. Also, the Tenderloin was another center. So the traveling ragtime piano players, all of them seemed to come by St. Louis and play at the Rosebud. And the Rosebud Cafe created something new. That is really the ragtime piano players created something new, namely the Wild Saloon. At the Rosebud, it was a nightclub, but there was a lot of gambling, and the prostitutes were upstairs. So there was all kinds of activity, and it could get pretty wild and crazy. But that, which became symbolic of the wild saloons of the far west. And that began at the Rosebud Cafe and also the Tenderloin in St. Louis. There was one occupational hazard. One of the fellow that was known as the greatest of the ragtime players in St. Louis, his name was Louis Chauvin. He was recognized as the greatest technician of the ragtime piano by his colleagues. Tragically, Louis Chauvin contracted syphilis and died at the age of 25. Frankly, that was an occupational hazard. If you're working every night in a red light district, the temptations are abundant. And when now we're going to, now this is a copy of the sheet music of the Maple Leaf Rag. The Maple Leaf Rag was one of Scott Joplin's earliest ones. He wrote that while working at the Maple Leaf Cafe, the Maple Leaf Club in Sedalia, Missouri. But this was composed and published in 1899. And it was immediately popular. It just swept the entire country overnight. Everybody loved ragtime piano, was listening to it and playing it. The sheet music was the principal way that the music was spread around the country. Also, gramophones and records. I have this map of North America to show that ragtime piano was a craze that swept overnight, not only across there weren't 48 states yet, but across the entire continental United States and as far north as Alaska and even the Klondike Gold Rush. So this African-American music started with the slaves when they landed in 1619. Their rhythm kept morphing into different musical forms. So the ragtime piano was the rage. African-American created ragtime spread to the remotest corner, one of the remotest corners in the world. And that was exactly the same year, 1898 was the Klondike Gold Rush, exactly the same time as gold miners were stampeding to Alaska and beyond Alaska up to the Klondike. Now this is an extraordinary historic photo taken by a Swedish photographer. This is in 1898. These are all gold miners, a long line. It looked like several hundred gold miners. They had to cross from Skagway, Alaska. They had to cross the Chilkoot Pass. And in order to get up the border of the Yukon is up on the top. Here's a closer look at these miners. They're carrying huge, heavy loads. By law, they had to carry 500 pounds of flour up into the Yukon. Oops, up into the Yukon Territory. Why? Because the first year of the gold rush, well, there was no grocery store in the entire Yukon Territory, period. You had to bring your own food. And enough gold miners, prospective gold miners, froze to death and died of starvation up in this remote, wild wilderness area that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police insisted that you bring 500 pounds of flour with you. So each of these miners had to carry, I don't know how many trips it would take, sacks of flour up and stack them and pass the Royal Canadian Mounted Police screening. Incidentally, when Diana and I were living in Alaska, teaching at Ketchikan High School, went to the senior center, we played music, and I got to know a fellow named Casper. He was a native, a Tlingit Indian, and he had worked carrying sacks of flour from Skagway up over the Chilkoot Pass. And he was still alive when we were living in Alaska, 1971. 1970, 71. I'm going to read part of this cut line under the picture. The stampede of 1898 included climbing the Chilkoot Pass from Alaska into the Yukon Territory, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police demanded that each miner bring half a ton of flour because there was no grocery store in the Yukon. Miners had been starving to death. This is irrelevant, but 4 of us climbed over the Chilkoot Pass, Diane and I and another couple, on a Yukon adventure. So in this town, this is Dawson City. This was the hub of the Klondike Gold Rush. It's where the Klondike River pours into the Yukon. It has degenerated considerably, but it's still a fabulous place to visit. Here is a graveyard of dead sternwheelers, riverboats piled up. And this next picture, this is myself at the riverboat Kino, which is still there at the docks in Dawson City. And here's a picture of Skagway. That was when the miners came from all over the world, including from Australia, from the former gold strikes in Australia, but all over the country. Prospective gold miners went to Seattle, got a boat to Skagway, Alaska, right here. That's one of the things that made Seattle a real city, by the way. A huge boom in 1898, 1899. People who were desperate to get rich from gold. They had no idea of the ordeal that they had to pass through. And many of them starved to death, of course, and froze to death. This Skagway, Alaska here is a wonderful historic town. It's the jump off point to go over the Chilkoot Pass and up into the Yukon. On the right side of the street, you see the Golden North Hotel, wonderful, beautiful historic hotel where we stayed. But this building on the left is called the Pack Train Inn, the oldest saloon in all of Alaska. It was built in 1897, first year of the gold rush, 3-story building, and this was the typical Wild West saloon. The ground floor was saloon. The second and third floor were where the prostitutes were working. So this was a pretty wild place. But if I may add a personal note, this was when we came down over the Chilkoot Pass from the Yukon River, stumbled into town pretty exhausted and filthy. And the Pack Train Inn was packed with people that evening. By the way, it was daylight virtually all night because this was in June, the land of the midnight sun. Anyway, there was an old upright piano that I was delighted to see, packed full house. So I talked to the owner of the place. He said, sure, go ahead and play some tunes on the piano. So I sat down and played some piano and the place went wild. They did a lot of sing-along to the tunes. One fellow grabbed my leather hat, prospector's hat, passed it around, and I made a fortune, and it was overflowing with money. It just, but what struck me was this, playing all these sing-along tunes from the turn of the century, the 1920s and 30s, people singing along. But if you walk down the street, the mud dirt street, you could hear the tinkling sounds of ragtime floating out. The tinkling sounds of the ragtime piano floating out over the swinging doors and up and down the streets of Skagway. The creation of the American Negroes, the African American music had gone from landing from the cotton plantations all across the United States overnight and swept all the way to Skagway and Dawson City. An enormous tribute to the contribution of African American musicians. By the way, next week we'll be able to hopefully see and hear a segment of the Hottell Ragtime Jazz Band at the Antlers Tavern. No. Okay, next, we're going from ragtime piano. Now we're going to jazz. Oh, is that stuck? Thank you. I'm going to try. Yeah. Okay, the pictures are stuck for a minute. Okay, this is an aerial view of New Orleans. It's odd coloring because it's an old historic postcard, as it says if you're in the fine print, the Mississippi River, Crescent City, New Orleans, Louisiana. And you can see why it's called the Crescent City. It's a huge circular bend, a crescent bend in the lower Mississippi River. Okay, from ragtime, the next form of Black-inspired music was jazz. And jazz, Dixieland jazz, was created, it was totally unknown to the rest of the country, rest of the world. But for several years, jazz evolved in the red light district in New Orleans, the famous Storyville section. It was a huge section, black section principally, and it was red light district. And since it was illegal, basically, each of these bordellos had a piano player, had live music, and of course, a lot of drinks, a lot of women working upstairs. But what was the African-American musicians were developing a totally new type of music. This is a huge moment of creativity. And they developed in all these bordellos. And finally, the officials finally shut down Storyville. So you have all these musicians, small bands, and even some large bands, playing Dixieland jazz, which had been a well-kept secret. And so in 1917, when Storyville was shut down, these bands needed work. They poured out of New Orleans. We're not stuck. Damn it. Poured out, I hope it's not permanent. Poured out of New Orleans, and they moved up the Mississippi River to other cities like St. Louis, Chicago, over to New York. So Dixieland jazz likewise spread across the country and became the real craze through the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. And what, yeah, oh, do you mind doing it for a while?
Yeah.
So here you see one of the Dixieland Jazz Band. This is Louis Armstrong sitting at the piano with his trumpet. Louis Armstrong's Dixieland Jazz Band. This is the type of band that left New Orleans and spread out all over the North, principally to the cities of the North. Oh, that worked. Here's another Dixieland band, a great photo. It's got all the traditional instruments, including the banjo there. So pause for a minute. What is jazz? And it takes a courageous person to try to define jazz, but it is based on improvisation, and the jazz kept the same song structure and the same chords, but what was new was the musicians took the melody of a song and played around with it. So the melody in the right hand, the musician could play around with it and just play any riff or any form that struck his imagination. And that's a short definition of what jazz was, originated. As a definition of jazz. Oh, by the way, here, this called the original Dixieland Jazz Band. That's ironic because these musicians are all white guys. The black jazz bands did not make recordings, partly because it was illegal to be playing in the red light district. But of course, the white bands immediately copied, and the first group to make a recording was this group of whites, and they called themselves the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Well, they were not the original at all, but they got that title. Next picture.
Did you want to play the Preservation Hall?
Not quite yet. Yeah, we can go back one. Let's go back to. Okay, now we're going to hear an example of the early Dixieland jazz. And this is the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. And the recording, oh great. Here is a picture of Preservation Hall, where Diana and I visited many, many times because we lived about 3 blocks away in New Orleans in the French Quarter. But the tune they're going to play is an early recording of the Tailgate Ramble. The Tailgate Ramble by the Preservation Hall Dixieland Jazz Band. All right, my voice is back on. So that was a great example of a Dixieland jazz band. You notice there were one or two white guys playing with them. In recent years, some white musicians are so good that they were invited to join the Dixieland, the Preservation Hall band. We're moving to okay, good, this is working now. Okay, now this graphic that I wrote out shows the origins of jazz. So where did jazz come from? It was like a miraculous apparition, an epiphany, but there were several different forms of music that fed into the creation of jazz, which of course happened in New Orleans, in secret for several years. But one of the contributors were the blues, also, secondly, the ragtime, and band music at New Orleans funerals. New Orleans is such a fascinating place. When the blacks die, they don't just get buried. They get buried to music. You have marching bands. And so that's where we're going next. Damn it. Okay, we skipped one there. There. Okay, here is a New Orleans marching band playing at a funeral. And here, I took this picture. This is at a funeral. The Eureka Brass Band. There were four leading bands that played for funerals and other occasions, of course, at the Mardi Gras. And what they do, and we marched, twice we went to jazz funerals when Diana and I were living in the French Quarter. But what they do, they follow behind the casket and go from Bourbon Street up to, up to the cemetery. This is the cemetery. It's the St. Louis Cemetery, right in the middle of the French Quarter. By the way, you notice that all the graves are above ground? Can you guess why? New Orleans is below sea level. That is much of it. The French Quarter is below sea level. If you go to dig a grave, it fills up with water immediately. So they're buried above ground. Anyway, on the way to the cemetery, the band plays slow, religious, lugubrious tunes like Just a Closer Walk with Thee. Then, once the person is buried here in St. Louis Cemetery, they go back down to Bourbon Street playing, and that's where we're going in the next piece of music in a second. They play The Saints Go Marching In. Yeah, go ahead. So here's, again, by the way, this fellow on the left, I've forgotten his name. He's 90 years old. He was 90 years old, totally blind. You can see from the milky look in his eyes, but he still played the trombone in the Eureka Brass Band. I just love it. The guy who stumbled along, blind, but he playing The Saints Go Marching In. See one more.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, now this is a funeral, a jazz funeral march.
This is the canoe that a young couple.
There. All right. My voice back on. So you've just witnessed a New Orleans jazz funeral. Extraordinary. I keep saying that New Orleans is one of the most fascinating cities in the country. It's just so rich with its French background. By the way, and what is the word jazz? Where did the word jazz come from? What does it mean? Well, jazz, it's derived from a Creole word, which means two things. A Creole word meaning both African dance and copulation. Okay, and now from New Orleans, I'm going to go on. This is another picture of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. Oh. We've gone from New Orleans, Black inspired music spread, as I mentioned, all the way to New York, Chicago. Now here's the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Harlem in New York became a very creative center for jazz music. And the famous Harlem Renaissance coincided perfectly with it. So jazz musicians came, some of them from New Orleans, went up to New York, to Harlem, of course, and Harlem sprouted many great songwriters and performing musicians. But the Harlem Renaissance was, it's where many different Black arts, that worked, flourished. The Apollo Theater is one of the centers. It was the great theater where a lot of the bands played and performers. But the Harlem Renaissance, all during the 20s, started in 1919 up into the early 30s. But the Harlem Renaissance, there was a flourishing of African-American poetry, writing, painting, and other arts, as well as music. So this next picture is there. This is, you recognize him, it's Langston Hughes, one of the great American poets, a Black poet. And next, this is one of his poems, Let America Be America Again. So I know some of you here are very familiar with it because of the Cindy Williams Gutierrez and the English teacher, the high school, had students write their own poetry, their own vision of America based on this poem by Langston Hughes. So Liberty Bell students, many of them are very familiar with Langston Hughes and this theme. What is your vision of America? That was the question. And some amazing poems came out of that were, by the way, broadcast from Studio A here in Twisp. This gentleman right here is one of America's notable painters. This is William O. Tanner from Harlem. And this is a picture you've seen before. It's called The Banjo Lesson. Here you have a grandfather teaching grandson the banjo. And this is a fully developed banjo created, of course, by the Africans and the African Americans on the plantations. Here's another painting called The Thankful Poor. You can see his themes, the themes of life of African Americans. And Harlem produced some of the greatest songwriters and performers in the history of jazz. Numerous from Harlem, people like, well, James P. Johnson had come up during the Renaissance, but James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington. And the next phase in African-American music was the Harlem stride piano, the Harlem stride bass. And this is James P. Johnson, the first who created this as a new style of bass. And here is Willie the Lion Smith, a larger than life, colorful person playing in a smoky club. What the stride bass was, these three piano players, including Fats Waller, they expanded the left hand of jazz, ragtime and jazz, to do more, to go farther up and down the scale and to do more complex work with the bass. And so what it did, it made the lower half of the piano expand in its sounds. If I can add a personal note, this man here, Willie the Lion Smith, spent most of his time up in Harlem. But when I was living in Washington, D.C. in 1966, I was a student at Georgetown University. I was actually playing piano 6 nights a week down at a honky-tonk joint, the Speakeasy. But up in Georgetown, there was a nightclub called Blues Alley, located in an alley. And I would go down there occasionally. And one night, just sitting in the audience was this man here, Willie the Lion Smith, one of the great creators of the Harlem stride bass. He was, and that nightclub is like, it was hard to find. It was really in an alley off M Street. So the place was very dark, very smoky, in an alley. And of course, it didn't take long before the owner of the club to say, ladies and gentlemen, we have in our audience here, not Bill Hottell, but Willie the Lion Smith. Would you be willing to come up and play and sing a couple of tunes, play some tunes? Which he did. And I will never forget that as long as I live. Fabulous keyboard jazz pianist. And he sang with a booming voice that rocked the place. Among other songs, he sang, "When You're Smiling, the Whole World Smiles with You." Never forget that. Anyway, that was just a very lucky moment for me. Also, another personal note, in the 1920s, well, when I took piano lessons in Spokane from Catholic nuns at Catholic school. But when I turned 14, my mother was wise enough to take me down to audition with Norm Toohey. Norm Toohey had a big band in Spokane, started in 1926 and played was one of the popular bands in Spokane from all the way up through the 50s, even into the 60s. And Norm Toohey, when he started his band in 1926, he learned the stride bass created by Willie the Lion Smith here, James P. Johnson, and Fats Waller. So that's what he taught me. So I learned the stride bass, and I've been playing it ever since. That was a piece of good luck to have him as a piano player. And finally, the third of the trio was this extraordinary man. This is Fats Waller. Fats Waller, absolutely one of the greatest pianists in the history of jazz, one of the greatest songwriters. Fats Waller composed over 400 songs in his short life. Among the most popular were Honeysuckle Rose, and also Ain't Misbehavin'. At age 15, he had dropped out of school, didn't like school. At age 15, he was working as a professional organist, playing the organ at the Lincoln Theater in Harlem. Also, he was so interesting. He was a star of the famous rent parties in Harlem. Whenever a friend or a neighbor was on the verge of being evicted because they didn't have any money to pay the rent, they'd invite, or rather Fats Waller would invite himself over and have a rent party. And these were wild. He was just a larger than life person. In his sheer size, he was bulky. He had a magnetic personality. And as you can just see from this picture of Fats Waller, that he was just alive. He was the life of the party. And he did live hard and fast life. And he was married twice. He devoted a lot of his time and energy to drinking and women. And he really wore himself out. His first wife couldn't take it. She divorced him. Anyway, there's an irony. Fats Waller, one of his favorite compositions was Ain't Misbehavin'. And that's ironic because if anybody was misbehaving, it was Fats Waller. He was misbehaving a lot. There's just one example. Well, he was quite an irresponsible person, I have to say. But he had a recording contract with RCA. First, it was just the Victor recording company, which became RCA Victor. So he said, one morning, he said, "Hey guys, I believe we have an appointment to do a recording down at RCA Victor." So they jumped in the car and started driving down from Harlem. And Fats said, "Well, what songs do you think we should record?" Most recording artists would rehearse ahead of time and take it more seriously. So they decided on what songs just on the fly. But that was typical of Fats Waller. And he did, it's often been said that he seemed to pack in 10 lifetimes of fun into his 39 years of life. It was a tragedy when he died, but he was really worn out. And to finish up Fats Waller, his funeral was, if you're familiar with Harlem, you probably know the Abyssinian Baptist Church. That's the biggest, I believe the biggest church. It's a beautiful stone church in the center of Harlem. Of course, a black church. And the eulogy was delivered by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. And it was one of the biggest funerals in Harlem. There were 4,200 people came to Fats Waller's funeral. And the eulogist, Adam Clayton Powell, said, among other things, Fats Waller always played to a packed audience, finishing up with his own funeral. And to finish up his life, Fats was cremated and his ashes taken up in an airplane, and his ashes were sprinkled all across Harlem. So Fats Waller is still there in several forms. Okay, we're finishing up right now, and we didn't get to rock and roll yet. So we're going to continue and finish up next week with rock and roll and some other final forms of American jazz, and then go on to another topic. But what we've seen today is amazing contribution of the Black slaves from Africa. The rhythm and music was still thriving for 400 years, taking on new forms, new expressions of rhythm. Okay, Deirdre, back, if you're there, back to you.
Hi, Bill, that was absolutely fabulous. Oh my gosh. Can't thank you enough. And what was so fun is when you started playing some of that ragtime music, I could see everybody's just smiling and bopping their heads. And
I have to
Really
say, I have to
fabulous.
say, in the studio here, Diana was dancing. She was boogieing also.
Oh, that's perfect. Oh, yeah. And just a reminder, everybody, you do have to register each time to get that outline and get the reminder of the link, but the same link can be used for each class. Because I just got an email from somebody that said, oh, I didn't receive the link for today. And I was like, oh, goodness. Okay. They'll have to watch the recording, but we thank you, thank you, thank you. And I wonder if Jim Archambault, are you there? Would you like to take the questions? I can read them, but it's just easier if
Okay.
you there? Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm here.
Has anybody written in questions yet, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah, we have several, Bill.
Good.
Mary Jane Perry asks, does the music of the Black church have the same beat as African music? And is that why the Black students that you spoke about clap that way?
Yeah, the Blacks take their rhythm, clapping, their music everywhere. So the Black churches is one of the great centers for their music, for their rhythm. Yes, yeah. At church they clap with great abandon. If you've been lucky enough to go to a Black church, when I was living in Washington D.C., Diana and I would go. There was a neighborhood Black church, and we went sat up in the balcony. We were the only white-skinned. I felt a little bit intruding, but it's just phenomenal to hear them sing. And by the way, next time we're going to hear some gospel singing. We're going to hear Mahalia Jackson and a gospel chorus. So we will next time be going into a Black church and see for yourself. It's absolutely extraordinary rhythm. Yes. Thank you, Mary Jane.
Walt Havens asks, and you may have already answered this, Bill, but he asks, are whites allowed to play in the Preservation Hall Jazz Band?
It was all Blacks. The Preservation Hall, of course, was established a long, long time ago, many decades ago, as a place where the original Dixieland jazz could be not only preserved, could be seen by outsiders, and it was all Blacks. And in recent years, from that one concert song, you could see that there was one white guy playing with the band now. So if somebody's good enough, they will invite, and if they need one or two whites, yes. And that
Okay,
band, go ahead, Jim.
go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I'm going to say that band goes on tour once in a while. They are so much loved in Japan that was a principal place where the Preservation Hall from New Orleans goes to Japan for concert tours. Yeah.
And then Christy just wanted to thank you for the introduction from last week to Babe Stovall. Said that she really enjoyed listening to his music.
Oh, that was with the Jimi Hendrix.
No, the person you spoke about, I think it was last week, the Babe Stovall. Is that, maybe I've got the.
Oh yeah, Babe Stovall. Oh good. Yeah, Babe Stovall became one of the great blues singers. Of course, he was discovered picking cotton in a Mississippi field, singing work song, labor songs. Yeah, yeah. And if you can Google, of course, and listen to him sing. He was fabulous. And he lived in the same neighborhood, lived on the same street that we did in the French Quarter in New Orleans. So we saw him singing and playing his guitar in the evenings.
And she also says that she found him on Spotify, the music service of Spotify.
Uh-huh.
So.
All right.
And then there's a couple of comments here. Kathy commented about PBS Masterpiece has a series running called The Long Song. It's about Jamaican slavery. And also there's an accompanying book by the Scottish author T.E. Devine. The name of the book is Recovering Scotland's Slavery Past, The Caribbean Connection, that apparently sits alongside this PBS series.
All right. Thank you for suggesting that.
And then there's a comment from Julian Seaman about the series Treme on HBO. features a lot of New Orleans jazz.
What's the series called?
Treme, Treme. I think it's one of the neighborhoods in New Orleans.
All right.
And then I put a comment on there. There's a wonderful jazz museum in New Orleans. And I was looking at their website this morning and found out that they're doing 6 or 8 virtual jazz events every week. And I believe they're all free. All different kinds of jazz, vocal jazz, instrumental jazz. So if you look at New Orleans Jazz Museum and then look for the events, it takes you right to those different concerts.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we of course were familiar with the Jazz Museum in New Orleans, visited it when we were living there. And that's how do you access that concert series again?
I found the calendar for it, Bill, and I believe you just click on the individual events. I have not yet listened to any myself, but
Yeah.
it looked like you could just click on the events, and there was a couple of several days out of the week. So, like I said, 6 or 8 a week.
So you just Google New Orleans Jazz Museum,
Right, and then look
Cool.
for the events tab there.
the events. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
That's it for questions.
Okay, no other questions from anybody? Observations?
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
I do have one other thought.
Thank you.
I do have a final thought. If you remember at the beginning, you saw the CD cover of myself doing the ragtime piano, and the other CD cover for Diana and myself. We still have a few of those.
Yeah.
There's a CD of our whole band, which is sold out a long time ago, but we do have some of those 2 CDs left in case anybody's interested. You can let me know.
Well, why is it called ragtime?
Because of the right.
Okay, yeah, why is it called ragtime? There's several different theories, but probably the best one is that the rhythm, that syncopated rhythm with the main beat and the offbeat sound to many like a ragged rhythm. And hence the name, they started calling it ragtime.